The morning Margaret Vang came home, there was a $400 fine pinned to her garden fence. The garden her dying mother had planted. She paid it. She smiled. She said nothing. Then she opened the HOA's financial records, all 132 pages, and started reading. What she found wasn't a fine. It was a system designed to push certain families out. Quietly. Legally. One violation notice at a time. 7 families of color. 17 notices in 8 months. Houses sold 50,000 under market, bought the next week by the HOA president's partner. Margaret had spent 30 years as a federal auditor. She knew exactly what this was. And she knew exactly where they'd made their mistake. Page 91. Clause 47. 62 words they assumed no one would ever read. They were wrong. Clause 47. The morning Margaret Elise Vang pulled into the driveway of 14 Crestwood Circle, the maple trees along the sidewalk were just beginning to bud, that particular pale green of early March that always looked, to her, less like growth than like the trees were testing the air before committing to it. She had been away for 14 months. The house looked exactly as she had left it, which was either a comfort or a disappointment depending on how you felt about time. She sat in the car for a moment with the engine off. Then she got out, took the cardboard box from the back seat, spices, mostly, and a small jade plant she'd kept on her desk in Washington, and carried it to the front door. Inside, the graduate student she'd sublet to had left things clean and neutral, the way people leave houses that belong to someone else. There was a thank you note on the kitchen counter. A half-empty bottle of dish soap by the sink. The refrigerator was often empty and smelled faintly of baking soda. She set the box on the counter and walked directly to the back door. The garden was still there. She stood at the glass for a long moment, looking at it. The lemongrass had gone dormant and straggly in the cold. The raised tomato beds were bare cedar planks, the soil dark and packed. The Thai basil was gone for the winter. But the structure of it was intact, the fence line, the corner beds, the bamboo stakes she'd left tied in bundles against the back fence like a small bundle of upright intentions. She exhaled. Then she saw the yellow notice pinned to the fence post. She read it standing up, then sitting at the kitchen table, then standing again with her coffee mug in one hand and the paper in the other. Notice of violation, Maplewood Grove HOA issued to, property owner, 14 Crestwood Circle. Violation Code, Section 12D, unauthorized landscape modification. Description: rear yard contains non-compliant vegetation, including food-bearing plants in excess of permitted single-specimen ornamental allowance. Per Resolution 2023-09, food gardens exceeding 150 square feet require written board approval and compliance review. Action required: reduce to compliance or obtain retroactive approval within 30 days. Fine assessed, $400. She folded it once, carefully, along its original crease lines. She placed it on the counter. She got out a yellow legal pad and a black pen. She wrote the date at the top of the page, then the violation code, then the words Resolution 2023-09 with a question mark beside them. Then she wrote, request full CC&Rs. Original filing date of resolution. Meeting minutes. She put the kettle on. This was how she started every case. Not with anger, not with strategy, with a list of what she didn't know yet. She had lived at 14 Crestwood Circle for 11 years. She had bought the house in the autumn after her divorce was finalized, which had been, in the strange arithmetic of difficult years, the same autumn her mother died. She had needed a place that was hers in some uncomplicated way, and the house on Crestwood Circle had been that, a 900 square foot colonial with good bones, a mature maple in the front yard, and a neglected back corner that the realtor had described, with professional optimism, as having real garden potential. She had made it a garden. It had taken 3 years to get the soil right. Her neighbor Harold, a retired high school principal who had grown up on a farm in the Shenandoah Valley and who died in 2021 and whom she still missed with the specific, quiet ache of losing someone who simply knew how to be a neighbor, had helped her build the raised beds from cedar planks one October weekend, and had explained to her, with the patient precision of a man who had spent 30 years teaching teenagers things they initially didn't want to know, the difference between soil that was merely brown and soil that was actually alive. The lemongrass had come from her mother's garden. Her mother had grown it in a dozen different homes over the decades, Minnesota, Illinois, Virginia, always starting it from the same root stock, which traced back to seeds she'd carried from Laos in a small plastic bag at age 22, seeds that had traveled past customs officers who'd turned them over in their hands with skeptical expressions and asked, in slow, loud English, what exactly this was. Herbs, her mother had said. For cooking. She had been right, and they had let her through, and she had planted those seeds in her first American garden and divided and replanted them for 30 years until the lemongrass that now grew in Margaret's back corner was, in some botanical sense that Margaret found genuinely meaningful, the same plant. She was not a sentimental person, on the whole. But she knew what the garden represented, and she knew what losing it would mean, and those were two different kinds of knowing. She downloaded the CC&Rs the next morning. 132 pages. She made a second pot of coffee and started from page 1. By the time she reached page 40, she had flagged 11 items on her legal pad. By page 70, she had a separate sheet titled Questions. By page 91, she had found clause 47. It was 62 words, tucked into a section labeled Financial Governance and Membership Rights, which sat between a section on insurance requirements and one on noise ordinances, the way important things sometimes sit between unremarkable ones, invisible unless you were the kind of person who read documents the way other people read maps, not for the landmarks, but for what was between them. Clause 47. In the event of credible concern regarding the financial management of the association, any member may request a formal independent financial review, provided such request is supported in writing by no fewer than 5% of member households. The board shall facilitate such review within 60 days of a valid request. 5% of 342 households was 17 signatures. She noted this. She wrote the number on the bottom of her legal pad and circled it twice. Then she kept reading. She found Resolution 2023-09 referenced in the board meeting minutes from November of the previous year. The meeting had been held on a Tuesday afternoon and had been noticed by email 48 hours in advance. 9 homeowners had attended. She turned to Article 4, Section 3 of the CC&Rs. All meetings at which binding votes shall be taken shall be noticed to member households no fewer than 72 hours in advance. A quorum of 12% of member households, 41 households, shall be required for the passage of amendments to standing rules. 9 households. 48 hours. She wrote, Resolution 2023-09 invalid. Procedural deficiency, 1, insufficient notice period, 2, quorum not met. She underlined both points. She was not, at this moment, doing anything particularly unusual. She had spent 3 decades reading documents that people assumed no one would read carefully, finding the places where stated policy and actual practice had quietly diverged, and following that divergence to its source. She had done it for the IRS. She had done it for HUD. She had done it, on a smaller scale, at her kitchen table for her mother's friends during tax season, translating the gap between what the government said and what it actually meant. She was simply doing it again. The documents were shorter than she was used to. The stakes were not. Diane Kowalski came by on the third day with a casserole and stayed for an hour and a half. Diane was 61, a retired middle school science teacher with short gray hair and the particular warmth of people who have spent decades paying attention to other people's children. She had lived 3 houses down from Margaret for 9 years and was, in Margaret's considered opinion, the most reliably honest person on the street. They sat at the kitchen table. Margaret had tea. Diane had coffee. The violation notice, Margaret said. I know, Diane said. I heard. When did Sandra Belmont become president? 2021. Harrington retired. She ran unopposed. Diane wrapped her hands around her mug. She's very organized. Who's on the board with her? Ted Halloran. He owns a landscaping company. Marcus Webb, who I think is retired. And Patrice Ogundamu, who I honestly think just wanted to help and has no idea what she got into. Margaret wrote the names down. The family on Birchwood, she said. The New Yens. You mentioned them on the phone. Diane was quiet for a moment. They moved in 2 years ago. A nice family, 2 parents, 3 kids, the mother was a nurse. In the first 8 months they were here, they got 17 violation notices. She paused. Noise. Parking. Guest vehicles. The string lights on their porch, Sandra said the color wasn't pre-approved. They sold in February. I heard they took $50,000 under what the house was worth. Who bought it? Some LLC. Out of Delaware. Margaret wrote, Win, 17 notices, 8 months. Sold under market. Buyer, LLC, Delaware. Fine name. There's something else, Diane said. She looked at her coffee. Felicia and James Washington. Elm Court. 15 years in this neighborhood, never a problem. Last spring they put up Kwanzaa decorations, red, black, green. Sandra sent an email to the community listserv. Not to them directly. To the whole listserv. About how holiday lighting needed to adhere to visual consistency guidelines. No policy cited, no rule referenced. Just a reminder. Diane looked up. And then the notices started. How many? 11 in 14 months. Hedge height. Trash bin placement. The basketball hoop in the driveway, portable, retractable, in their own driveway. She paused. And Sandra stopped Felicia in the driveway one morning. No witnesses. Told her she should think carefully about whether Maplewood Grove was really the right fit for her family's lifestyle. The kitchen was quiet. Margaret looked at what she had written. Lifestyle, she said. That's what Felicia told me. Margaret underlined the word. Once, firmly. Sandra Belmont came to her door on a Thursday, 7 days after the violation notice, wearing a sage green blazer and carrying an iPad in a tan leather case. She drove a white BMW X5 with a vanity plate that read MV001. She was 58 years old with highlighted blonde hair and the polished, territorial confidence of a woman who had decided that her neighborhood was her jurisdiction and had spent 4 years proving herself right. She stood at the door without coming in. She had the practiced warmth of someone who had learned to deploy pleasantness as a tool of control. Mrs. Vang, she said. Welcome back. I hope you've had a chance to look over the notice. Ms. Vang, Margaret said. Would you like to come in? Sandra declined with a small, gracious tilt of her head. She had her iPad open. She began explaining the board's concern about visual consistency and community standards and the importance of everyone pulling together to protect property values. Margaret listened without interrupting. When Sandra finished, Margaret said, Resolution 2023-09, which is the resolution your notice cites, was passed at a special session held November 14 of last year. The meeting notice was sent by email 48 hours before the meeting. Your CC&Rs require 72 hours notice for meetings at which binding votes are taken. 9 homeowners attended. The CC&Rs require a quorum of 41 households for rule amendments. She paused. The resolution was never validly passed. Sandra's expression didn't change, exactly. But something in it compressed slightly, a tightening around the eyes, a fractional recalibration. Administrative details can always be addressed retroactively, she said. Procedural requirements aren't administrative details, Margaret said. They're conditions of validity. She held the door. I'll be sending a written response to the notice within the week. Is there anything else? Sandra looked at her for one beat longer than a comfortable pause. I'd recommend consulting an attorney before making formal claims, she said pleasantly. I'll take that under advisement, Margaret said. She closed the door. She stood in the hallway for a moment with her hand on the knob, listening to the measured click of heels on the front walk. Then she went back to the kitchen and wrote 3 more lines on her legal pad. She knocked on the Washingtons' door on a Saturday afternoon. James Washington answered. He was 57, a large, methodical man who had spent 28 years as a mechanical engineer at a defense contractor in Fairfax and who had the air of someone who solved problems by taking them apart carefully, piece by piece. He looked at Margaret, he clearly knew who she was, and opened the door wider without saying anything, which she took as an invitation. Felicia Washington was in the kitchen making coffee. She was 54, a hospital administrator, a woman whose default posture was efficient and direct. She had the controlled stillness of someone who had learned to manage powerful feelings in professional settings and had perhaps brought that skill home more than she'd intended to. They sat at the kitchen table. Margaret asked if she could take notes. They said yes. She listened for 45 minutes. 11 violation notices. The portable basketball hoop in their own driveway. A notice about the height of the rear hedge which, James had measured carefully, was 2 inches above the CC&Rs limit, a limit that, when Margaret looked it up later, was not actually in the CC&Rs at all, only in a board email that Sandra had sent and labeled a clarification of existing standards. The Kwanzaa lights, Felicia said. We'd had lights up every year since we moved in. Never a problem. In 2022 we did red, black, and green specifically, we'd never done those colors before. 2 days later Sandra sent that email to the listserv. And the conversation in the driveway, Margaret said. Felicia looked at the table. She was very quiet. Very controlled. She said that Maplewood Grove had a particular character that was important to maintain. She said she hoped we were comfortable here. A pause. And then she said that if we were finding the community's expectations difficult, it might be worth considering whether this was the right lifestyle fit. She looked up. I knew exactly what she meant. I didn't say anything. I went inside and I cried, which I'm still angry at myself about, and then I filed everything she'd ever sent us in a folder that I've been adding to since. You have it? Margaret said. Felicia got up and came back with a manila folder 3 inches thick. Margaret looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at Felicia. "Can I make copies of these?" "Take the originals," Felicia said. "I made copies weeks ago." She went to see the Nguyens, David and Kim, and their 3 children, now living in Alexandria, on a Sunday. She drove 45 minutes. They sat in their new kitchen, which was smaller than the one they'd had in Maplewood Grove, and Kim made tea and David spread his own folder of documents on the table and said, with a tiredness that had nothing to do with the hour, "We didn't want to leave. We loved that house. But after a while it just felt like we were being told to go." 17 violation notices in 8 months. Noise complaints for a child's birthday party held on a Saturday afternoon. A parking notice for a vehicle belonging to Kim's mother, visiting for a week from California. A notice about the front door color, a deep red that the previous owners had installed and that was visible in the listing photos Kim had showed Margaret on her phone, photos that predated the Nguyens by 3 years. "Did you push back?" Margaret asked. "We tried," David said. "We sent letters. We requested meetings." Sandra Belmont responded once, in writing, to say the violations were valid and that repeated violations could result in a lien against the property. He paused. "We had a mortgage. We had 3 kids in school. We couldn't afford a legal battle." Margaret wrote, "Lien threat used as coercion. Against homeowners who'd done nothing wrong." She drove home thinking about the specific cruelty of using the thing people were most afraid of, losing the home they'd worked for, the stability they'd built, as a lever to move them out of it. She spent the following week on the financials. She filed a public records request with the Virginia State Corporation Commission and identified the Delaware LLC that had purchased the Nguyens' former home, Clearwater Holdings, LLC. She found Clearwater Holdings was managed by a registered agent tied to a second LLC, Blue Ridge Residential Partners, which had purchased 2 other properties in Maplewood Grove in the past 3 years at prices notably below the neighborhood's market average. Blue Ridge Residential Partners listed a Richmond address. Its sole member was listed as Christine Beaumont. She searched Christine Beaumont. She found a contractor's license. She found that Christine Beaumont was the owner of Beaumont Property Services, a maintenance and repair contracting firm. She searched Beaumont Property Services in the HOA's financial records, which had been posted, partially, selectively, on the community website. Beaumont Property Services had been awarded contracts with Maplewood Grove HOA in 2020, 2021, 2022, and 2023. Total posted contract value, $218,000. She pulled comparable pricing data from the Virginia Department of General Services schedule and from 3 other HOAs in the county whose financial records were publicly available. She built a spreadsheet. The pattern was not subtle. Beaumont Property Services was consistently billing between 40 and 70% above market rate for comparable work. A roof repair on the community center, $43,000. Industry standard for the stated scope, $18,000 to $24,000. A parking lot resurfacing, $31,000. Market range, $14,000 to $19,000. She sat back and looked at the spreadsheet. Somebody had been spending the community's money. Somebody had been choosing who got to spend it. And the same person who chose the contractor had, through a series of LLCs, been buying houses that her selective enforcement had helped push onto the market at below market prices. She added a new tab to the spreadsheet and labeled it Beaumont Property Services, Contract Analysis. Then she added a second new tab and labeled it Properties Purchased by Clearwater/Blue Ridge. She worked until midnight. She was not angry. She was focused, which was a different thing, a colder thing, more useful. She found Charles Beaumont through Diane. No relation to Christine Beaumont, she verified immediately. He lived at 11 Crestwood Circle, directly across the street. He was 67, a retired naval officer, a large, private man who kept his yard immaculate and had, to Diane's knowledge, lived in the neighborhood for 22 years without drawing any particular attention to himself. Margaret knocked on his door on a Wednesday afternoon. He answered in a flannel shirt and reading glasses and looked at her with the patient, measuring expression of a man who had spent a career distinguishing between what people said and what they meant. "Mr. Beaumont," she said. "I'm Margaret Vang. I live across the street. I'm building a factual record of HOA management practices in this neighborhood, and I'd like to ask if you've observed anything that, in your judgment, wasn't right." He was quiet for a moment. "Come in," he said. He made coffee. They sat at a kitchen table that was, Margaret noted, as organized and clean as a briefing room. He spoke in the same way, sequential, precise, without editorial inflation. He had seen Sandra Belmont stop Felicia Washington in the driveway twice. He described both incidents in detail, including approximate date, time of day, and duration. He had observed a Beaumont Property Services truck at the community center for 11 consecutive days during a roof repair that had involved, by his estimate, 4 to 6 hours of visible work. He had noted the dates. He had observed 3 other instances of what he described as conspicuously disproportionate enforcement activity directed at families he named, all of them, he noted, without emphasis, families of color. "You wrote this down," Margaret said. "My late wife was a paralegal," he said. "She believed that if something seemed wrong, you wrote it down, because your memory would eventually fail you and the other party's documents would outlast yours." She was right. He got up and came back with a spiral notebook. She reached to take it. He held it a moment before releasing it. "I kept this because I didn't know what to do with it," he said. "I'm not a confrontational person. I didn't know who to give it to." He looked at her across the table. "I think I was waiting for the right person." "I'd like to return this to you," she said. "Keep it," he said. "I have a copy." In October, Lily came home for a long weekend. She was 26, a second-year medical resident at Johns Hopkins, who had her mother's eyes and her grandmother's directness and a habit of arriving with opinions and leaving with more questions than she'd brought. She stood in the back door on the first morning looking at the garden. The lemongrass had come back strong. The tomato beds were up. "Someone's trying to make you tear this out," she said. "Yes. And you're not going to?" "No." She turned around. Her mother was at the kitchen table with the laptop and the legal pad and the color-coded folders that had been accumulating since March. Lily sat across from her and looked at the spreadsheet. "Walk me through this," she said. Margaret walked her through it. The contracts. The LLCs. The properties. The violation patterns. The timeline. Lily was quiet for a while. Then she said, "You know what this is?" "I know what it looks like," Margaret said carefully. "It's a system," Lily said. "It's not just one bad person doing one bad thing. She built a system. Enforced selectively to pressure certain families. Families sell under market. Her partner's LLC buys them. Then the contractor overcharges the HOA and the money comes back somehow." She paused. "How does the money come back?" "That," Margaret said, "is the part I don't have yet." She had been thinking about this for 3 weeks. She knew what the mechanism probably was, a referral fee structure, a pass-through entity. She had seen it in her federal work. But she needed the bank records to prove it, and she couldn't get the bank records without a formal investigation, and she couldn't trigger a formal investigation without giving someone with authority a reason to open one. "So how do you get there?" Lily asked. "I find someone at the Virginia AG's office who handles HOA fraud," Margaret said. "And I give them everything I have and let them get the rest." "Do you know someone there?" "Not yet." She picked up her pen. "But I know someone who does." She called Robert Chen the following Tuesday. He had been her senior supervisor during 4 years at HUD, a careful, methodical man who had spent his career building the kind of institutional knowledge that only exists in the minds of people who have done a thing long enough to know all its failure modes. He had retired the previous year and was, by his own account, enjoying retirement about as much as he'd expected to, which was not very much. She explained the situation briefly. She told him she believed she had documented evidence of systematic contract fraud and discriminatory enforcement, but that the financial transfer mechanism, how the overcharged contract money was cycling back to the board president, was beyond what she could access without a formal subpoena. "You don't need me to explain pass-through structures," he said. "You've seen them." "I need a name," she said. "Someone at the Virginia AG's Consumer Protection Division who handles HOA complaints. Specifically HOA fraud." A pause. "Karen Osei. She runs the HOA enforcement unit." Which sounds small until you realize how much money moves through HOAs in Northern Virginia. He paused. "She's good. She'll know if what you have is a case or a grievance." "What's the difference, in her judgment?" "Cases have numbers," he said. "Grievances have feelings. From what you're describing, you have numbers." "I have numbers," Margaret said. "And feelings. But I know which ones to lead with." She began collecting signatures for the Clause 47 petition in October. She did it the way she did everything, methodically, without drama, house by house. She did not pitch it as a fight. She brought a single printed page, the CC&R's text of Clause 47, a short explanation of what an independent financial review would entail, and a 3-line summary of the fee increase pattern, HOA annual fees had risen from $2.800 to $5.040 per household over 4 years, a 80% increase that corresponded precisely with the period of Sandra Belmont's presidency and the Beaumont Property Services contracts. Most people, when presented with that number, said, "I didn't know it had gone up that much." She had 19 signatures in 4 days. She had the 22 she needed by the end of the first week. She filed the Clause 47 request by certified mail, return receipt, to the HOA's registered address, to Sandra Belmont personally, and to the board's attorney. Sandra's response came by email within 48 hours. The tone was warm and cooperative. The substance was delay. The association's financial records were currently under internal review. They would be made available in accordance with standard procedures. The board looked forward to demonstrating its commitment to transparency. Margaret read this and looked up the relevant Virginia statutes. She read Section 55(1) to 1815 carefully. There was no provision for an internal review period that suspended a member's right to financial records. She documented the email, the date, and the discrepancy. She filed it in the folder labeled Clause 47, Board Responses. She sent a reply citing the statute. She received a second email, this one from Granger and Polk LLP, a real estate firm in Richmond, advising her that continued demands could expose her to legal counteraction. She looked up Granger and Polk. The managing partner was Douglas Polk. Douglas Polk's sister-in-law was Christine Beaumont. Christine Beaumont owned Beaumont Property Services. She added Douglas Polk to the spreadsheet. She sent a single-sentence reply to Granger and Polk, "Please direct all future communications to Margaret E. Vang, CPA, at the above address. My Clause 47 request remains outstanding." She copied Karen Osei's office on the correspondence, along with a brief cover note explaining the context. Karen Osei called her on a Tuesday in November. She had been driving back from the farmer's market when the call came through. She pulled into the parking lot of a CVS and sat with the engine off. Karen Osei's voice was measured and direct, the voice of someone who had learned to be efficient not from urgency but from a long familiarity with complexity. "I've been reviewing your submission," she said. "And some parallel documentation my office has been building independently." The Wynn family filed a complaint, Margaret said. "In March of last year." A pause. "Before they moved. We'd been developing it slowly. HOA fraud cases are resource intensive and they often don't have the financial profile to justify a formal investigation." She paused again. "Until they do." "What changed?" "The Washingtons filed a civil rights complaint in August. And you sent me this." A brief silence. "Ms. Vang, your memo is, I've been in this office for 11 years. I want you to understand what I can and cannot say to you." "Of course. I can't discuss the details of an open investigation." "I understand. What I can say is that what you've documented is organized, sourced, and internally consistent. You've done work that typically requires a 3-person team and a subpoena to assemble." A pause. "I'd like to meet with you in person." "I'm available Tuesday." "Tuesday at 2 o'clock, Karen said. "My office in Richmond." Margaret sat in the CVS parking lot for another minute after the call ended, looking at a grocery bag of jasmine rice and lemongrass in the back seat. Her mother had bought jasmine rice in the same kind of bag, the same white and blue paper, every week for 40 years. She put the car in drive and went home. In November, on a Tuesday night, someone egged the front of her house. She saw it at 6 in the morning when she went out for the paper. 3 eggs, front door and the wall beside it, already partially dried. She went back inside and got her camera. She photographed it before touching anything, wide shots, close shots, the angle of impact. She wrote the date and time and weather conditions in her log. Then she got a bucket of warm water and cleaned it off. She did not call the police immediately. She thought about it carefully and then called them the following morning, because a police report required the responding officer to write up the incident, which created a record, which was the point. She was polite with the officer. She gave him her documentation. He wrote the report without enthusiasm, which was fine. She had not expected enthusiasm. What the egging told her was that someone was watching her closely enough to know she was a problem worth discouraging. That information was useful. She sent a brief email to Sandra Belmont that morning, noting the incident, requesting the board address it as a neighborhood safety matter per their governing obligations, and informing Sandra that she had filed a police report and that all documentation was being retained. She received no reply. She had not expected one. She attended the HOA annual meeting in December. She arrived 8 minutes early and took a seat in the 3rd row. She had brought a legal pad and 2 pens. She wore dark slacks and a gray blazer. She nodded to the people she recognized and said nothing in particular to anyone. The room filled up. 209 residents, the largest attendance Diane had ever seen at a Maplewood Grove meeting. Sandra Belmont stood at the front of the room in a champagne blazer, poised and practiced, her iPad on the table beside her. She ran the meeting with fluent competence. She showed slides, photographs of the renovated pool deck, the repaved front gate, the new security cameras. She thanked the community for its continued support. She announced a 14% increase in the annual HOA fee, citing infrastructure investments and rising maintenance costs. She described the board's enforcement activity as evidence of its commitment to protecting property values for everyone. The floor opened for questions. 3 people asked about parking rules. 1 person asked about the pickleball court proposal. Margaret raised her hand. Sandra looked at her. A pause, perhaps a half-second longer than a normal pause. Ms. Vang. Margaret stood. I'd like to ask the board to provide a line-item breakdown of maintenance expenditures for the past 3 fiscal years, including vendor names, contract values, and the competitive bidding process used for each award. The room was quiet. Our financial records are available for review by appointment, Sandra said. I've requested that review twice, in writing, Margaret said. Both requests were declined without statutory basis. She looked at her legal pad. I'd also like to ask the board to address the contract awarded to Beaumont Property Services for the community center roof repair in April. The posted invoice was $43,000. Comparable work in this county, for a structure of that square footage, runs between $18,000 and $24,000. I'd like to understand how that contract was priced and competitively bid. Silence. A different kind of silence from the one before. Sandra smiled. It was the smile she used when she wanted someone to understand that she was in charge of the room and not them. I'd caution the community against giving credibility to unsubstantiated allegations that could expose the association to legal liability. I'm asking about the association's own expenditures, Margaret said. These are fees this room pays. The request is in writing. She held up her legal pad, a simple gesture. I'd appreciate written responses within 10 business days. She sat down. She noticed, in her peripheral vision, that Marcus Webb, one of the board members Diane had named, was looking at the table. After the meeting, 6 residents she didn't know came to find her. She gave each of them her phone number. She went to Richmond on a Tuesday in December and spent 3 hours with Karen Osei in a conference room on the 4th floor of the Perimeter building. She had prepared a binder with color-coded tabs, which she placed in the center of the table. Karen Osei was 41, with natural hair and a burgundy suit and the focused efficiency of someone who moved through her workday without wasted motion. She asked questions that told Margaret a great deal about what she already knew and what she was trying to confirm. She worked through the binder methodically. The quorum violations. The contract analysis. The LLC structure connecting Beaumont Property Services to Clearwater Holdings. The enforcement pattern mapped against household demographics. 40 minutes in, she stopped taking notes and opened a recording application on her laptop. You have the demographic analysis, Karen said. 7 of the 9 households receiving more than 10 violation notices in the past 2 years are households of color, Margaret said. I tracked it against census data and the HOA's own household registry. And the 2 that are not. One is a same-sex couple on Maple Way who removed their pride flag from the porch approximately 3 weeks after their first notice. The other is a single mother on Birchwood who works double shifts and stopped responding to notices after the 6th one. Karen looked at the binder for a moment. The referral fee mechanism. How did you conclude there was one? I concluded there probably is one, Margaret said. I don't have the bank records to prove it. The contract overcharging is documented, the gap between market rate and billed rate. Where that gap goes, I can't trace without a subpoena. Karen nodded slowly. That's the part we can get. She closed her copy of the binder. She looked at Margaret across the table. Most people who come to my office with HOA complaints bring us an experience, she said. Something that happened to them, and how it felt. That matters, and we take it seriously. But you've brought us a case. She paused. Your documentation is the most complete self-assembled filing I've seen from a private citizen in this office. I had good material, Margaret said. The board kept detailed records. They assumed no one would ever know how to read them. She collected signatures through January. She needed 51 to trigger the full Clause 47 provision, which she had reread 7 times and which she had come to think of less as a rule and more as a key that had been sitting in the lock for 22 years waiting for someone to turn it. By the 2nd week of January she had 43. By the 3rd week, with Kevin Park, a software engineer on Birchwood who had received 8 violation notices and who, once he understood what the petition was, had gone door to door on his own block for 3 evenings. She had 58. She filed the petition on a Thursday morning. Certified mail, return receipt, to Sandra Belmont personally, to the HOA's registered agent at the Virginia State Corporation Commission, and to the board's attorney at Granger and Polk. She attached the signature list, a copy of Clause 47, and a 5-page memo she had written over 2 evenings, setting out the procedural deficiencies, the contract discrepancies, and the enforcement pattern, with supporting citations on every paragraph. The memo was spare and factual. No adjectives that weren't necessary. No emotional framing. She had written it the way she wrote every professional document, as though a skeptical, intelligent person was going to read it and look for any reason to discount it, and she wasn't going to give them one. She drove to the post office and waited in line and slid the envelopes through the window and drove home. She made tea. She stood at the back door. The garden was getting its February dormancy, brown and quiet under a pale sky. She could see the shape of what it would be in 2 months. The lemongrass crowns under the soil, already preparing. Sandra Belmont's attorney sent a cease and desist in February. It was 3 pages, formally worded, demanding that Margaret withdraw her Clause 47 petition, retract the statements she'd made at the December meeting, and cease harassing communication toward board members. Margaret read it at the kitchen table. She identified 4 claims in the letter, checked each one against the CC&Rs and the relevant Virginia statutes, and noted in the margin that all 4 were either legally incorrect or strategically bluffed. She sent a single-sentence reply: "Please direct all future communications to Margaret E. Vang, CPA, at the address above. I do not intend to withdraw the Clause 47 petition." She sent a copy to Karen Osei with a cover note, "For your records." 2 weeks later, the Virginia AG's office sent formal document requests to the Maplewood Grove HOA. Sandra Belmont's attorney filed objections. The AG's office responded. This process moved at the pace of institutional machinery, which is to say slowly but with its own kind of inevitability. Margaret did not find this frustrating. She had spent 30 years working inside institutions. She understood that their slowness and their authority were often the same thing. In March, Ted Halloran resigned from the board. He sent a brief email to the community listserv citing personal commitments. He did not elaborate. Margaret logged it with a date and a note: "First departure." Timing coincides with AG document requests. In April, Marcus Webb attended a community coffee hour that Diane had organized and spoke carefully, in the presence of about 20 residents, about his belief that the board had not always followed its own procedures. He did not name Sandra Belmont directly. He did not need to. In May, Patrice Ogundamu, the board member Diane had described as someone who had wanted to help and hadn't known what she was getting into, sent a personal email to Margaret. It was brief and formal and said only, "I want you to know that I was not present at the November 2023 special session. I was told afterward that the resolution had passed and was presented with the minutes to sign. I signed them. I shouldn't have. I'm sorry." Margaret replied, thanking her. She filed the email. Lily came down from Baltimore on a weekend in April. She brought groceries and made dinner and sat at the kitchen table after eating with her hands around a glass of water, watching her mother update the tracking spreadsheet. "How close are you?" she said. "The AG's investigation is running independently," Margaret said. "My part is mostly done." "How do you feel about that?" Margaret considered the question. "Like a structural engineer who submitted the report," she said. "The bridge is either sound or it isn't. Someone else decides what to do about it." Lily was quiet for a moment. "Mom," she said. "What you've done here, what you're doing, I want to make sure you know it matters. Not just the legal outcome. The fact that the Washingtons aren't alone. The fact that the New Yens have a record of what happened to them." She paused. "Grandma would have. She'd have said I should have started in March," Margaret said. Lily smiled. "That's true. She would have. She was usually right," Margaret said. She looked at the spreadsheet for a moment. Then she closed the laptop and went to the kitchen window and looked out at the garden, which was coming back now, the lemongrass sending up new green shoots from the established crowns, insistent and unhurried. She carried seeds from Laos in a plastic bag, she said, more to herself than to Lily. Past people who wanted to confiscate them. Across a country she didn't know yet. She paused. "I keep thinking about that." She didn't fight loudly. She just documented. Kept going. Didn't give up the thing she brought. She turned back to the kitchen. "That's what this is," she said. "The same thing." The community meeting in June had 219 residents in attendance. Sandra Belmont arrived with her attorney and a prepared statement. She read it standing at the front of the room with a composure that Margaret, watching from the 6th row, found genuinely impressive in its discipline. The statement acknowledged administrative process concerns, proposed a governance reform committee, and expressed Sandra's personal dedication to the community. When she finished, the floor opened. David Park stood up first. He had lived on Birchwood Lane for 12 years. He spoke without notes, quietly, about receiving 8 violation notices in 14 months, about the specific notices, his car in his own driveway, his daughter's bicycle on the front porch, the color of his recycling bins, and about the phone call he had received from Sandra Belmont on the morning after his third notice, in which she had suggested that consistent compliance would reflect well on his family's standing in the community. He said it calmly. He sat down. Felicia Washington stood next. She described the 11 notices. She described the conversation in the driveway. She said the phrase lifestyle fit quietly, in a room of 219 people, and the room absorbed it in total silence. James Washington, beside her, put his hand briefly on her shoulder. Kim Wynne was not there, she was in Alexandria, but Kevin Park had a printed statement from her, which he read aloud in a steady voice. Margaret did not speak. She had said what she needed to say in the documents. This was the community's hour, not hers. She sat in the 6th row and watched and took notes out of habit, recording the date and the attendance and the names of everyone who spoke. The Virginia Attorney General's formal findings were released in September. The report was a public document, 41 pages, available on the AG's website. Margaret downloaded it at 6:45 in the morning with her first cup of coffee. She read it slowly. The report found that the Maplewood Grove HOA board, under Sandra Belmont's leadership, had engaged in improper procurement practices, including systematic failure to solicit competitive bids, procedural violations in passing binding resolutions, including the November 2023 special session, unlawful denial of homeowner financial review rights, and a pattern of selective enforcement of HOA regulations that, the report stated, evidence discriminatory intent based on race and national origin, in violation of the Fair Housing Act and Virginia Code Section 36-96. 3. She read that sentence 3 times. She had documented it. She had believed it. She had never been certain it would survive into the final language of a government report, which tends toward conservative conclusions. It had survived. The financial investigation, conducted with bank records obtained under subpoena, found that the overcharging on Beaumont Property Services contracts had resulted in $294,000 in excess payments over 3 years. Of that amount, $178,000 had been directed through a referral fee agreement to Hartley Residential Consulting, LLC, a single-member LLC formed in November 2019, 2 months after Christine Beaumont's first HOA contract, whose sole member was Sandra Belmont. The pattern Margaret had described as probable was now documented in public. The AG's office referred the matter to the Fairfax County Commonwealth's attorney for criminal prosecution. Christine Beaumont's contractor's license was suspended pending investigation. Sandra Belmont resigned from the board that afternoon. Margaret heard about the resignation from Diane, who called at 4 o'clock. She was in the garden when her phone rang, cutting back the lemongrass stalks that had gotten too tall. She pulled off her garden gloves and answered. She resigned, Diane said. Effective immediately. 1-sentence letter to the board. Margaret said nothing for a moment. Are you okay? Diane said. I'm fine, Margaret said. She looked at the lemongrass. I'm going to finish this and then make dinner. That's all? That's all. She put the phone in her pocket and pulled her gloves back on and kept working. The sun was low and the yard was quiet and the lemongrass came away cleanly in her hands, the way it always did when you cut it at the right time. A new board was elected in October. Felicia Washington was elected treasurer, which Margaret thought was the right outcome for reasons both practical and symbolic. Charles Beaumont from across the street accepted a role on the governance committee. Kevin Park, who had spent his evenings walking Birchwood Lane collecting signatures and had turned out to be both energetic and meticulous, a combination Margaret valued, was elected to a general board seat at 31 years old, the youngest board member in Maplewood Grove's history. Patrice Ogundamu, who had sent Margaret the quiet email in May, was re-elected. She had earned it, Margaret thought. The new board's first meeting lasted 4 hours. Margaret was not present. She had been invited to attend in an advisory capacity and had declined, suggesting that the board would benefit from starting its work without an audience. Their first action was to commission a full independent audit, using a firm with no existing relationship to any current or former board member. Their second was to formally rescind Resolution 2023-09, effective immediately. Their third was to send written letters of apology and notification of record correction to every household that had received discriminatory enforcement actions, 11 households in total, including the Wynne family in Alexandria, who received their letter 3 weeks after closing on a new house in Falls Church. Diane told Margaret about the letters over coffee. Margaret said she was glad. "You're not more than glad?" Diane said. "I'm glad," Margaret said. "And tired. Which is different from unhappy." "You should feel, I don't know. Triumphant." "Accountants don't feel triumphant when the audit comes back right," Margaret said. "They feel like the work was worth doing." She was invited in November to speak at a Virginia homeowner rights conference in Richmond. It was organized by a coalition of housing advocacy organizations, tenant groups, community associations, a legal aid organization. The venue was a hotel ballroom. About 220 people attended: homeowners, housing attorneys, community organizers, 2 state legislators. She almost declined. She was not, she knew, a natural public speaker. She had spent her career speaking through documents, letting the numbers carry the argument, letting the paper trail close the case. Standing at a podium was a different skill. Lily, when told, was characteristically direct. "You've testified to the Virginia AG's office. You've spoken at 2 HOA meetings with 200 people. You know the material. It's different when it's presented as a speech." "Then don't present it as a speech," Lily said. "Present it as a briefing." That, Margaret decided, was actually useful advice. She drove to Richmond on a Thursday morning. She brought 4 pages of notes and a single slide printout of Clause 47 that she pinned to the podium in front of her. She stood at the podium for a moment before speaking. The room was the way conference rooms always were, too bright, slightly too cold, full of people with their own complicated relationships to the subject at hand. "I want to start with what I'm not," she said. "I'm not an attorney. I'm not an activist. I'm not a particularly confrontational person, and I don't enjoy standing at podiums." A brief, quiet laugh from the audience. "I'm a CPA. I spent 31 years reading financial documents that people assumed no one was reading carefully, and most of what happened in my neighborhood happened because the people doing it were confident that their records would never be examined by anyone who knew what to look for." She talked about Clause 47 specifically, this provision that had sat on page 91 of the Maplewood Grove CC&R since 2001, never invoked, because nobody had ever read that far. She said it wasn't unique. Similar provisions existed in the governing documents of most Virginia homeowners associations, and in some form in most states, typically called financial review rights, audit request provisions, or member inspection rights. She said that these provisions were regularly buried in document sections with unremarkable titles, positioned to be skipped, written in language that discouraged engagement. She said this was not always accidental. "Governing documents are long," she said. "They're technical. They're written in ways that implicitly say, this is not for you, this is for lawyers and administrators. And so most homeowners sign them at closing, put them in a folder, and never look at them again." She paused. "And the people who administer these communities know that. The selective enforcement I documented in Maplewood Grove worked, for years, because the people being targeted didn't know they had the right to ask for the financial records that would have shown them what was happening. They didn't know because they'd been given 132 pages and told, implicitly, not to bother." She talked about what she had found. The contract overcharging. The LLCs. The enforcement pattern. She didn't name anyone, the report was public and the names were in it, but she described the structure of it. "What I want to be clear about," she said, "is that this wasn't a single bad actor making individual bad decisions. It was a design system. The enforcement and the contracts and the below-market sales all work together. That kind of system depends on the assumption that no one will look at all of it at once. It depends on the burden of proof sitting entirely on the people being targeted, people who are exhausted from fighting, who have mortgages and children and jobs, who calculate, reasonably, that the cost of fighting back is higher than the cost of going along." She looked at her notes. "The way you disrupt that calculation is by making the record. Not the argument, the record. If someone sends you a violation notice, respond in writing and retain the copy. If someone tells you something verbally that you know to be wrong, write it down the moment you're alone, with the date and the exact words as best you can remember them. If you file a request and don't receive a response, note the date you filed and the date you didn't get an answer. Not because you're planning a lawsuit, you may never be. Because the record belongs to you, and no one can take it from you once you have it." She paused. "There is a broader point I want to make, and I want to make it plainly." She looked at the room. "The families in my neighborhood who were targeted were not targeted randomly. They were targeted because the people running that system had made a calculation about who would fight back and who wouldn't, and that calculation was based on race and national origin. That is documented. It is in the AG's report. It is not a suspicion or a political argument, it is a finding of fact." She paused again. When we talk about homeownership and community governance and property rights, we have to be willing to look at who those systems actually protect and who they actually harm. Not in theory, in practice. With names and dates and spreadsheets. She picked up the water glass. The last thing I'll say is this: I found Clause 47 because I read the document. All 132 pages. I know that's unrealistic for most people. But I'd ask you, at a minimum, to read the section on member rights. In most governing documents, it's the section everyone skips. In most governing documents, it's the section that has everything. She drove home in the early dark, the highway quiet, the radio on low. She thought about her mother's notebook. The bills, the appointments, the conversations recorded in careful, looping Lao script and English block letters on lined paper, translated when necessary by Margaret at the kitchen table. Her mother had not kept that notebook because she expected to need it as evidence. She'd kept it because she had understood that in a world that frequently asked you to prove your own experience, you were better served by having the proof. She turned onto Crestwood Circle at 7 o'clock. The neighborhood was still in the November evening, porch lights on, the maples bare, a thin sliver of moon above the Beaumont house. She parked in the driveway and went inside. She stood at the back door for a moment. The garden was done for the year, brown and resting. The lemongrass had been cut back to its crowns. The tomato beds were cleaned out, the cedar planks dark with autumn moisture. She had a small glass jar on the kitchen windowsill. Thai basil seeds, saved in September, from the plants that had come from the seeds her mother had given her, which had come from the seeds her mother had carried from Laos in 1972 in a plastic bag past a customs officer who hadn't known what he was looking at. The jar would last the winter. In the spring, she would plant again. She put the kettle on. She sat at the kitchen table. She opened her legal pad to a fresh page. She wrote the date at the top. Then she put down the pen and just sat there for a moment in the quiet kitchen, with the kettle beginning its slow ascent toward boiling and the jar of seeds on the windowsill and the garden outside doing whatever gardens do in the dark, resting, preparing, waiting for the right conditions to become what they already were. 1 year later, the Wynn family received a settlement of $67,000 from the Maplewood Grove HOA, representing the documented gap between their 2023 sale price and the neighborhood's assessed market value. Kim Wynn used a portion of it to establish a small scholarship fund at her children's new school. The Washington family received written apology and the formal expungement of 11 violation notices from their permanent HOA record. Felicia Washington, as the new board treasurer, oversaw the independent audit that reduced the annual HOA fee from $5.040 to $3.840 per household, the first reduction in the fee in 9 years. Sandra Belmont was charged with wire fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and conspiracy in March. She entered a plea agreement in August. Christine Beaumont's contractor's license was permanently revoked following the PRS investigation. Douglas Polk retired from active practice at Granger & Polk. The firm's representation of the Maplewood Grove HOA was formally terminated by the new board in December. Clause 47 became the subject of a brief article in a Virginia real estate law journal, which was cited by the Virginia Housing Alliance in a model governance reform document distributed to community associations statewide. 3 other HOAs in Northern Virginia used Clause 47 provisions in their own documents to initiate independent audits within 18 months of the Maplewood Grove case. 2 of those audits found significant financial irregularities. Charles Beaumont was re-elected to the governance committee by a wide margin. He accepted the position on the condition that meeting minutes would be distributed to all 342 households within 5 days of every meeting, a condition the board accepted without objection. Diane Kowalski ran for the board on a platform she described to Margaret, over coffee, as, "I'll read all the documents and answer my emails." She won by 47 votes. Kevin Park introduced a mandatory new homeowner orientation program that included, in its first session, a guided reading of the CC&Rs with highlights, bookmarks, and a cover page that said, "The most important section begins on page 89. Margaret was invited 3 times to join the board. She declined each time. She offered instead to serve as an informal financial advisor, available when needed, which the board accepted. She asked for nothing in exchange except to be consulted early rather than late. She did not advertise this. She had no title and no official role. She had a phone number and a reputation, which, in a neighborhood of 342 households, proved to be enough. The garden, the following spring, was the best she had ever grown. The lemongrass came back stronger than it had been in years, the crowns having spent the winter deepening in the dark soil. The tomatoes on Harold's cedar frames flowered in April, earlier than expected. The Thai basil from the windowsill jar came up in 2 long rows that filled the back corner of the yard with a fragrance that was specific and clean and, to Margaret, The precise smell of continuity, of something carried forward from one place to another by people who had decided it was worth keeping. Lily came home in June for a long weekend. She stood at the back door on the first morning with a cup of coffee, not saying anything for a while. "Grandma would have loved this," she said finally. "She did love it," Margaret said. "She planted the first ones." They stood together in the morning light. The garden, unhurried, asked nothing of them but to be there. They stayed.